I don't think I need to introduce Amish to you guys based on the way you just welcomed him right now. But it's not loud enough?
I guess.
I'll try and bit
Closer. Yeah, it's too cold. Yeah.
Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay, wonderful. So, Amish Tripathi wanted to be a historian. He became a banker and somehow ended up as the best-selling novelist India has ever seen. So tell us how this happened.
The history bit or the writing bit?
All of it, yeah.
All
They
right.
want to know everything.
Okay, that'll take a long time. I've lived nearly 39 years. It's a long time. Yes, you're right. Mobile phonam nidhanam. It's in the Sanskrit scriptures. Mobile phones are banned. Yes, I did want to be a historian. When I was young, I was always very passionate about that subject. But, in the India that I was growing up in, history was not a wise career option. As people would joke and say, beta history vishti to theek hai, kaam kya karoge? So I did the logical, pragmatic thing. I graduated in science, in mathematics, and then I did an MBA from Calcutta, and I worked in banking for 14 years. And I can't say I had a passion for history. I didn't have, passion for writing. Passion for writing. Yeah. I didn't have one creative bone in my body. I'd written absolutely no fiction before The Immortals of Meluha, not even a short story in school, absolutely nothing. I was a completely left-brained, quantitative kind of guy.
So where did this come from? Where it just appeared from where?
Good question. See, because most of the friends who know me from college or, most of them are quite stunned that, Sala, Amish ne kitab kaise likh diya? Because I had written some poetry, but that's all in college. That was terrible. It was very bad poetry. And my wife, who's out here, and my son, Neil. My wife at that time, she was my girlfriend. This was 20 years ago. Yeah, we've grown up together, basically. And most of my poems were for her. She was the only person who liked my poems. No one else liked them.
I think we're going to have to ask her.
Hey, you like my poems, right?
Yeah. She did. She said yes.
She's a good wife.
Yeah.
So, I'm as stunned as anyone else that I've actually written some books. I'm even more stunned that some people actually like them. The books began as a pure philosophical thesis, actually, as an exploration into the nature of evil, an answer to that question, what is evil? And some of that philosophy is based on my understanding of the Upanishads, particularly the Isha and the Katha Upanishad, but all the Upanishads. And some of it my own thoughts. And so it began as a pure philosophical thesis, actually, the Shiva trilogy, which got converted into an adventure.
Well, it was a great combination. So tell us, do you come from a religious family, and are you personally religious yourself?
Yes, I do come from a very religious family. My grandfather was a Pandit in Banaras and a teacher at Banaras Hindu University. He used to teach mathematics and physics. He had also done a master's in Sanskrit. And both my parents are very religious, so that's the atmosphere I grew up in. And they were also very liberal, which is not a contradiction in traditional India, actually.
And it's sad that it's become something that people think should be a contradiction.
No, in fact, I think for a vast majority of Indians, it's still not a contradiction.
It is not, I agree.
Religiosity and liberalism go hand in hand in India. There's a very tiny minority of religious extremists in India. Frankly, there's a very tiny minority of secular extremists also in India who are equally idiotic, in my mind. Majority of us Indians are religious and liberal, and I grew up in that kind of atmosphere. So we were encouraged to question, we were encouraged to explore, and that's how I know much of what I know of our mythology and our scriptures and our philosophies. I did turn into an atheist in the early 90s for nearly 10
Just
12
say it
years.
Again so everyone can hear you.
No, I did.
Amish Tripathi was an atheist.
I was.
He just said it.
For 10, 12 years. This was...
How did you become an atheist?
This was in the early 90s. We were in college at that time, and we had a big gang, some 20 of us, and I was in Mumbai, my home, And Mumbai sadly passed through a phase of insanity in the early 90s. We were having repeated communal riots, one community attacking another, then another community attacking back. There were bomb blasts, there were riots, and our entire gang, all of us, we started blaming religion for it. Our gang was, majority of us were Hindus. It's a reflection of the country. But we also had Muslims, Christians, Parsis. My wife is half Parsi. And our gang, we started blaming religion for these fights. My father, like I said, he's a very devout man. So he used to try and tell me that if you find religious extremists creating chaos, it's even more important that we religious liberals stand up and speak even more loudly. But I was a teenager. I didn't really understand his words at that time. And I understand it now. I returned to faith with
So how did you return?
Books.
So you grew up in a religious family, you became an atheist, and then you went back to the faith.
To faith, yes.
To faith. And tell us, how did that happen?
There's a bright flash of light, and I suddenly just woke up and... No, okay. To be honest, it happened slowly. As I wrote more and more of my books, I found myself drawn back to faith. And, I no disrespect to any other god, but if for someone like me who's naturally a rebel, I'm naturally, frankly, slightly anti-elitist, anti the authorities. It's just the way I am. So for someone like me, Lord Shiva is a very, and no disrespect to any other god, but he is in a way the perfect god to pull someone like me back to faith. Because he is the classical rebel god. He's a rule breaker. He treats his wife with love and respect. Even in his traditional, in the traditional way Lord Shiva and Parvati ji are shown, they sit shoulder to shoulder as equals. He holds the children on his lap many times. He dances, he sings, he smokes marijuana.
What's not to like? Yeah.
So so I guess he kind of pulled me back to faith. And today I understand what my father used to tell me, that there's beauty and ugliness in every single religion, like in every single part of life. And it's up to us, what do we want to see?
Find the beauty in it.
Exactly. And as my father has in his puja room, similarly in my puja room at home, I have an idol of Lord Shiva, whom I worship every morning. But I also have idols of other Hindu gods, of Lord Ram, of Krishna ji, of Durga Ma, of Kali Ma, and also of symbols of other religions. So I have a picture of the Muslim Kaaba, of Jesus Christ, of Mother Mary, of Zarathustra ji, the Zoroastrian prophet, of Gautam Buddha, of Guru Nanak ji, and I worship all of them every morning. There is something to be learned from every religion. I strongly believe that.
I find this particular thing very interesting because it's amazing that. And tell us something about the inspiration you draw from other religious traditions, like you say, but this is a wonderful thing about you, and I think a lot of people would agree that everyone draws inspiration from different religious traditions.
There is something to be learned from every religion, and I always say that, in fact, I am not doing anything new actually. I am following the Indian tradition. Right here in Rajasthan actually, there is a sect of Muslims called the Manganyar Muslims. I'm sure some of you have heard of them. They are devout Muslims. They pray 5 times a day. And they dress, they look like Muslims. The vocation that they have is that they sing devotional ballads, and ballads devoted to Lord Ram. And you should see one of their performances. It brings tears to your eyes because before they begin, they start with a prayer to Lord Ram. And they're Muslims, and they don't think they're doing anything wrong. And those of us in the audience who watch them, we don't think they're doing anything wrong. In Mumbai, there's a Mount Mary Church, which is a Christian church. Many of the people who visit the church are Hindus and Muslims. My wife and I, we also visit that church. And we go and pray in our own way. The Christians don't get offended that we are praying in our own way. We don't think we are doing anything wrong. Right here, close to Jaipur is Ajmer Sharif,
yes.
Which is the tomb of a Muslim Sufi saint. Majority of the people who visit there are Hindus. And this is the Indian way. So I always say that I am actually being more Indian by respecting all religions.
I think there's something to be learned, and I wish there were more people like you in India.
There are. I'm telling you, a vast majority of us are religious and liberal. The problem is we keep silent. We let the fringe elements of religious extremists and secular extremists dominate the narrative. They are both idiots, and we religious liberals need to speak more loudly. The secular extremists look down on us, religious people, like we are some...
That's the message everyone in this audience should be taking away from today.
The secular extremists look down on us, religious people, like we are apparently anti-scientific idiots, which is nonsense. And the religious extremists think that pride in their religion means that they have to hate another religion, which is equal nonsense.
Absolutely.
But fortunately, a vast majority of Indians don't think this way, which is why we are a stable country.
Absolutely. Well, that's actually very inspiring. So now tell us a little bit about your books. So you've written 3 books. You've written The Immortals of Meluha, Secret of the Nagas, and Oath of the Vayuputras. Did you always conceive of this as a trilogy, even though this came to you in a blinding flash of light?
Yeah. In my mind, they are not actually 3 independent books. It's one continuous story. It's just been divided into 3 for convenience, because you can't release a 2,000-page book. It's a human rights violation. The only choice that I had was a way to break up the story into 3 books. But actually, it's a continuous story. You can't read book 2 without reading book 1. It won't really make sense. It's not like the Ibis trilogy, for example. You can read the second book before reading the first book. It'll still make sense. In fact, actually, that's how I read it. So I knew Behram's story before Diti's story. But it makes sense. You don't have to follow it. But in my book series, you have to read it in order.
In order.
Yeah.
And Amish's books are going to be made into a film, which Karan Johar is going to be producing.
Yes.
So is it all going to be together in and if you read the paper this morning, you will. There's something happening in Hollywood as well.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about it, or is it a secret?
I'm sorry, I can't speak too much about it. Sorry, so sorry.
Well, you heard it here first.
But yes, a deal has been done. It'll be announced.
Well, let's congratulate Amish on his Hollywood deal. And what are you working on next?
I am working on I've started work on a book series. It is going to be in the history mythology space. I think that's about it. Listen, my publisher, he's put this ironclad contract on me. I'm not allowed to speak more.
So,
sorry.
What I thought I'd do is I'll ask you one last question, and I know the audience is here to speak to Amish, so we want to sort of invite you into the conversation, and we'll be opening it up for questions very soon. But just before we do that, do you have any advice for aspiring authors in our audience today?
Before that advice, is it possible to get anything slightly warm? My throat's about to collapse. Sorry, I'm from Mumbai. I'm used to, 2 seasons, hot and hotter.
Me also.
Advice for writers. I'd say 3 things primarily. Firstly, when you write. You have to write with the purity of your heart. You have to care 2 hoots about anyone else's opinion. And when you write, you must realize that you have to write for yourself. You're writing because a blessing has come to you. And that book serves a purpose for your soul. So care 2 hoots about editors, publishers, critics, and frankly, even readers. Write only for yourself. That's the first rule. The second rule is there is this practical minor problem of money. Unless you're lucky to be born rich and daddy's left a lot of dosh for you, regrettably not in our case. So you actually have to work for a living. And my suggestion is, look, if your aim is to make money, trust me, there are far easier routes. Okay, there are a few lucky people who can make money out of writing, but a vast majority do not. So have a job on the side, because then you don't have to compromise on your book to pay your bills at the end of the month. I had a job on the side. It was an exciting banking job. No, seriously. Okay.
He is serious.
Hey, listen, most bankers go skipping and whistling to the office. Now, at least they...
No one believes you.
Okay, they skip and whistle when the salary comes in. Okay, the benefit of a banking job is that you have or any job, is that you have something which is paying the bills. Therefore, you don't have to compromise on your writing. My first book, it was rejected by every publisher that was sent to, but
Not
there
me,
was
but-
one editor who was willing to publish it. But he wanted some changes in the book. He told me that, there's too much gyan in your books, philosophical gyan. So,
Famous last
yeah,
words.
so he told me that it's a good fast-paced story, but this gyan is unnecessary. If you drop this, he'd be willing, he told me that if I drop this, he'd be willing to publish the book. Now, if I was dependent on the book to pay my bills, I don't know, I may have been forced to compromise, but because I didn't need the book to pay my bills, I could tell him to get lost, which was good, because
And liberating.
because if the book had succeeded in that way, I would have still been desperately unhappy, because it wouldn't have come out the way I wanted it to come out. So the second advice is always have a job on the side, so that you don't have to compromise on your writing. Either have a rich daddy or have a job, so that you don't have to compromise on your writing. The third thing is the minor problem of pragmatism. Once you finish the book, you have to be a practical guy and figure out how do you sell this thing. Okay, you have to invest your mind space and time into marketing. A good book doesn't sell itself. That's a fallacy. I'm a voracious reader. I can give you a long list of books which should have been bestsellers, but they're not, because no one marketed it. How the hell will you buy a book if you haven't heard of it? So you have to invest your time and effort in marketing. There are authors I know who refuse to go for book events because they think, oh, we are authors. I think that's unethical. If your publisher is investing money in your book, the least you can do is support the publisher. So
very happy to hear
the third thing is, once you finished your book, you have to be practical and pragmatic and spend time and effort in marketing. So these are the 3 rules.
So I hope everyone was taking notes. So now we're going to open it up for questions and invite you into the conversation. So there's this lady over here who was the first to raise her hand, so I'm going to ask her to go first. And just say your name. And introduce
Good morning,
yourself.
sir. I'm Vishakha.
Amish, yeah, not sir.
Okay, Amish. Amish, you've been, a lot of people call you the Dan Brown of India.
Okay.
Since you've mixed up mythology, fact and fiction together.
Okay.
So, what are your comments on that?
I think
On follow-up.
that's probably too kind. I think the only commonality between Dan Brown and him is he's brown, I'm brown skinned. But I think he writes very well. I think the research that he does in his books is fantastic. I'm not sure I'm of that order, but thank you so much. Thank you so much.
There's
We
no
have a
set.
question here at the
Yeah.
back.
Hi, this is Shravan this side.
Sorry, Shravan.
Yeah.
Shravan. Hi, Shravan.
Hi. Many of my friends have been inspired by your books, and it's a rage across all the engineering colleges that I've been in.
No, thank you.
And they actually refer to their marijuana time as the Shivji time. Many of them.
As the what time?
Shivji time.
The shifty time.
Shivji.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
like,
Oh, Shivji time. sorry.
Shivji time. Okay.
yeah. So my question to you is, have you tried it?
I think before
I'm-
he says anything, I have to say you're having a Bill Clinton moment here.
No, look,
I didn't inhale.
I'm a devoted Shiva worshipper, and in one second, let me clarify. On Mahashivratri nights, all of us Shiva worshippers, we stay up all night. It's a tradition. We stay up all night. We pray, we dance, we sing, and yes, we smoke up or drink bhang as well. I am not suggesting that you guys should do that. It's not a good habit. But I do want to say that, I'm speaking seriously now. Marijuana has sadly just got a lot of bad press. It's actually less harmful for you than alcohol and nicotine. I've been, little bird has told me there are apparently some parties tonight, and they're going to be serving alcohol at those parties. Okay, so marijuana is actually less harmful for you than alcohol, even. Of course, it's less harmful than nicotine. It's in India, actually, it was legally available till a few decades ago. There was an international movement driven by the US, actually, which forced practically all countries to ban the marijuana, and now the US is actually reversing that ban in a few states. In India, actually, many decades ago, the government would actually sell marijuana in shops.
They still do, by the way. It's
and
called
some-
the Sarkari Bhang ki
Now,
dukaan.
the point I'm trying to make now,
You
wait,
think I'm joking,
having
but
said
I'm
all this, having said all this, every single intoxicant, be it alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, they're not good for you. That's the first rule. And a philosophical rule in life is that if you're not able to handle it, don't do it. Okay? And once a year is okay. More than that is not. The idea is not to lose a hold on yourself. I am not recommending marijuana as a way of life. It's not good for you. Okay? Try spirituality. It gives you a much better, longer lasting high. You know, seriously. Yeah?
बेटा मैं आपसे एक प्रश्न करना चाहती हूँ
हाँ, नमस्ते.
कि आपकी जो लेखनी है उसमें
जी.
क्या आपके बचपन की जो दादी नानी कहानियां सुनाती थी आपको
जी.
माइथोलॉजी के ऊपर
जी.
उसका कुछ असर
नहीं, बहुत असर रहा है. जैसा मैंने कहा था, मेरे बाबा जो थे वो पंडित थे बनारस में, और हमें सिर्फ कहानियां नहीं, वो फलसफे के बात भी करते थे. हम लोग उपनिषद के बारे में बात करते थे, सिर्फ पौराणिक कथाएं नहीं. और बाबा हरदम कहते थे कि भाई कहानी इतनी महत्वपूर्ण नहीं है, महत्वपूर्ण ये है कि कहानी के पीछे फलसफा क्या है. क्योंकि कहानी एक जरिया है फलसफे तक पहुंचने का. फलसफा क्या है कि वो आपको जीने का तरीका सिखाता है. तो मेन चीज वो है, और उसे भूलना नहीं चाहिए. कहानी तो अलग अलग हो सकते हैं. आप मिथोलॉजी जो शब्द है, इसका अगर आप रूट ढूंढेंगे तो इसका एक ग्रीक शब्द है मिथोस. और मेरी पत्नी और मैं, हम लोग ग्रीस गए थे कई साल पहले. एक ग्रीक महिला से हम लोग मिले थे, और मैंने उससे पूछा था कि भाई अंग्रेजी में कि भाई ये मिथोस का मतलब क्या है, क्योंकि डिक्शनरी में तो कुछ और, शब्दकोश में कुछ और ही मतलब लिखा हुआ है. तो उसने बताया कि ग्रीक लोगों के मुताबिक मिथोस इज दैट विच हाइड्स द ट्रूथ, जो सत्य को छिपाता है. और आपका आपका मिशन कह सकते हैं, मिशन ये है कि भाई वो सत्य को आप ढूंढ निकालें. तो कहानी में लॉस नहीं हो जाना चाहिए, कहानी में घूम जाना नहीं चाहिए. इंपॉर्टेंट बात यह है कि फलसफे को आप ढूंढ निकालें.
Hello, I am Apurva.
Hi, Apurva.
I have this question for you. You were mixing mythology with the reality. So, and you know the Indian mindset that we do not accept mythology in any different way. So, were you ever facing any fear of controversy or any other fear? Did you ever face?
You know, I'm not being facetious when I say this, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. That if you want to write a book like this, there isn't a better country than India to do it. The reason for this is that if you actually look in our past, there are so many interpretations of mythology that you lose count of it. The version of the Ramayana that's most popular in North India, Maharashtra northwards, is the Ramcharitmanas. And the reason why people know that version is because in the 1980s there was a television serial made by a gentleman called Ramanand Sagar, and the source material that he used for his Ramayana television serial was the Ramcharitmanas. But the Ramcharitmanas is actually a 16th century modernization of the original Valmiki Ramayana. Now we know Sita ji as a docile, submissive goddess. If you read the original Valmiki Ramayana, she's a far stronger character. Okay.
Tell us a little more about her as a character in
there
the
are so many versions of the, and actually if you want to see the versions of the Ramayana where you have Sita ji as a stronger character, there's a version of the Ramayana called the Adbhut Ramayana, which was written in the 12th century, which means 400 years before the Ramcharitmanas, the version that all of you know. You guys call it the Ramayana, but the Ramayana that you know is actually the Ramcharitmanas. In the Adbhut Ramayana, it wasn't Lord Ram who killed Ravan, it was Sita ji who killed Ravan when she took her true form as Ma Kali. Okay? There are nearly 300 versions of the Ramayana. Some say maybe thousands of versions of the Ramayana. And in many of them, the stories are vastly different. And none of them cause any controversy. And this is just the Ramayana. If you look at the Mahabharata, there are so many different interpretations of the Mahabharata. If you read the Purans, for example, we are all aware that there are 18 Mahapurans. Depending on how you count, you can say there are 19 Mahapurans as well, because there's some who believe that even Vayu Puran is one of the Mahapurans. In the Mahapurans, you will find contradictions between different Purans. So, for example, the birth of Lord Kartik is described differently in the Shiv Puran and is described differently in the Skanda Puran. Now, which version is right? I don't know. Okay, it doesn't matter. There's this lovely line in the Rig Veda from the Asya Vamasya hymn, which says, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one, but the wise men speak it as many. Right? All of us have a right. All of us have a right to our own interpretation, and as long as you do it with devotion and respect, there's no reason for any controversy. And this is not idle talk. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. My books have sold a reasonable number till now. I haven't faced one controversy. And more often than not, I'm telling you, the sad truth is in India, controversies are created, sadly. There are authors who idiotically go around creating controversy in the stupid hope that it will sell their books. Even my book, the first book, there was a PR agent who advised me that, look, let's create some controversy, that's what will sell the book. And my wife and I were aghast when he gave us that advice. Because he said, boss, all you need is some 10 people. We were like, what? He said, no, it's about the angle of the camera. If the TV camera is at a low angle, 10 people seem like a lot. They can just be burning your books. I'm like, and this is sadly what happens. Controversies are created. There are, maybe 1 or 2% cases where controversies happen genuinely, but in vast majority of cases, they don't. A vast majority of Indians are liberal enough to respect a different point of view, as long as you do it with devotion and respect.
It's a question from the back.
Hi, my name is Anjali.
Hi, Anjali.
I wanted to ask you said that you were an atheist when you started writing book and became a religious again. So why chose Lord Shiva and mythology when you were an atheist?
I think the real answer is, I didn't really choose him. He chose me because I didn't even want to be a writer. And if you think about it, it's a little logical, because if I wanted to write an adventure to explain a philosophy on evil, then who better to be the hero than the destroyer of evil himself, Lord Shiva? So it's kind of natural that he emerged as the hero. And like I said earlier, no disrespect to any other god, I just find him a very attractive god. He genuinely is, very cool.
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, first you and then we go to the back.
Good morning, Amish. My name is Audita.
Hi, Audita.
My question to you is that you have made many. I'm a very huge fan of your trilogy, firstly. And secondly, I would like to ask that you've made huge changes in your book, as in literally, may I use the word disrupting the real how mythology is. So, Amish, where do you think you draw the line to, no, I can't go beyond that, I can't change that, because I'm a myth freak. I call myself a myth freak. So myth freaks around the world use the term when they say that, there's a certain boundary line when you're changing myths to suit your books. So where do you think you draw the line there?
Okay, the first thing, and which is what I spoke about, earlier, is that in India the real question is, what is the real myth? Because there are so many versions. Like, let me give you another example. We are told in the Ramayana that Lord Ram worshipped Lord Shiva at Rameshwaram, right? Which means Lord Ram came after Lord Shiva. And he worshipped, and it is mentioned to us that he worshipped Lord Shiva and Parvati ji. Which means what? That Sati ji had died and she had reincarnated herself as Parvati ji. Correct? That's what we know. Now, there's another myth that Shiv ji and Sati, it's very specific. Shiv ji and Sati ji were coming out of Agastya Muni's ashram. Okay? And they ran into Lord Ram, who was searching for Sita ji at that point of time, which means Sita ji had been kidnapped already. And he was searching for her at that point of time. And this myth is very specific. It doesn't say Shiv ji and Parvati ji, it says Shiv ji and Sati ji. Okay? And Sati ji didn't recognize Lord Ram as Lord Vishnu's avatar, or as the Americans go, avatar. Now this myth is in contradiction with the earlier myth. Now, what is the real myth? And once again, I come back to that Vedic line. How does it matter? Now, when I write the book, how do I work? you know, I know it might sound strange, but I don't set the boundaries. He sets the boundaries because I don't create the story. I can't explain where it comes from because I had written absolutely no fiction before The Immortals of Melua. I don't have one creative bone in my body. I open the laptop and it's almost like I'm given the privilege of entering another universe and recording what I see. And I don't have any control over the characters of that universe. There was a point of time when I was trying to control the story at the beginning. There was this one particular character whose fate I was very unhappy with, and I desperately wanted to change it. Whatever I was doing wasn't working. It was seeming like a force fit. And I'd actually stopped writing. And it was my wife, Preeti, who helped me out. She told me that you're approaching it like, you know, in a typical stupid MBA style. You think you control the story. You don't. You're only a witness in a parallel universe. So she told me this line that, and I love this line, you know, I've quoted it I think 1,000 times, that don't approach the story with the arrogance of a creator, approach it instead with the humility of a witness. Okay? So which means he creates a story, he sets the boundaries. I just follow.